All right, so it is 2:02. We have a pretty good group here. So why don't we just get started and I'll just let other people in as they come in. And so let's see. I don't usually, I mean, Catherine may sometimes do some housekeeping stuff, but I'm not going to do that because that's not really my role. But I am here to introduce a couple of women, very bright women who have been in my lab for different amounts of times, but doing awesome work. Both of these women, both Anjeli and Marie, joined as interns and both joined as Harvard undergraduate students. Anjeli has now graduated and is at Harvard Medical School. Congrats. And Maria is only a sophomore, so it's even Oh, I mean, it's just like super impressive that she's been able to do this. And she did a lot of that work in her freshman year, which seemed a little nuts, but she did it nonetheless. She's a go-getter. So we're gonna start with Anjali, and she's gonna give her talk. And then we'll go on to Maria. And we can have, I guess, some questions after Anjali's, but depending on the timing, I just want to make sure that both students have a full amount of time to give their presentations. Yeah, so then we'll do that. And so Anjali, as I said, right now she's a first year medical student at Harvard Medical School. And she graduated earlier this year in May, the bachelor's in neuroscience and a minor in social anthropology, and she's really interested in integrating advocacy for women experiencing IPV-related brain injury into her future medical practice. So I'm super excited about that because we need more people like that. So without further ado, she's going to talk about her talk, which is entitled Associations Between Strangulation-Related Acquired Brain Injury and Neurobehavioral Outcomes in Women Who Have Experienced Intimate Partner Violence. Wait, is that right? No, that was the wrong one. Associations between pediatric brain injuries and IPV-related brain injuries in adulthood. I'm like, that's not what she's going to talk about. That's Maria. Maria is going to be talking about that last one. All right, now you're out of heads up. So yes, Angela's going to be talking about childhood brain injuries and how they may be predictive of later IPV-related brain injuries. So you should be able to share your screen, Anjali. So whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and do it.
Sure, that sounds great. Can you hear me okay? My AirPods have been acting
You
up a little bit.
you sound perfect.
Great, that's awesome. Are you able to see my slides?
Looks excellent. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I've been working with the Valera Lab, I think, since 2022, and Eve has talked to us at length about all the incredible work that Pink Concussions has done. So it's really a great honor to be here. So as Eve said, I'll be presenting on a paper that I've been working on with the lab called Pediatric Brain Injuries Are Associated with Intimate Partner Violence-Related Brain Injuries in Adulthood.
I will
And
just interject for a second because she's being a little modest. It was just accepted into Journal of Head Trauma Rehab. So
yeah, very exciting.
it's actually in press right now. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I didn't want to forget to say that.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, very exciting. Yeah, so to provide a little bit of background about why we're specifically interested in this question. So I wanted to first talk about the prevalence of IPV, intimate partner violence, as well as IPV-related brain injuries. So as I'm sure you're all well familiar with, is that IPV is quite common. So 1 in 3 women in the US report experiencing some form of intimate partner violence. And in addition, these women who are experiencing IPV are also at a greater risk for sustaining brain injuries or BIs due to physical abuse that's often targeted to the head and neck. So whether that be through an external force like a fist or foreign object, or by strangulation-related causes. And so what we see in the literature is actually there's a pretty strong association between experiences of IPV as well as child abuse. So women experiencing IPV are 2 to 3 times more likely to report experiencing prior abuse as a child, whether that be through physical means, emotional, or sexual. And what's really interesting is that when we look specifically at IPV survivors who sustained brain injuries from physical violence, is that adverse childhood experiences, including abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, are actually much more common among those survivors who sustain brain injuries compared to match controls who did not sustain IPV-related brain injuries. So what our current study wanted to do was kind of look at that association as well. So to provide a little bit of background about pediatric brain injury, So this is a leading cause of mortality and permanent disability among children across the globe. And some of the most common causes include falls or unintentional blunt trauma, such as from sports-related injuries like hits from a baseball or soccer ball, motor vehicle collisions, and physical abuse. So some of those are the most common causes. And pediatric BIs are linked to a whole host of long-term adverse outcomes, including learning disabilities, mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, inpatient hospitalizations in psychiatric wards, lower educational attainment, as well as premature mortality, defined as below the age of 40. So what our study wanted to do was look at specifically the associations between pediatric brain injuries or those sustained at or below the age of 12 and IPV-related brain injuries later in life. And so what we hypothesized was that participants who sustained at least one brain injury in childhood would be significantly more likely to sustain an IPV-related BI later in life compared to those who did not sustain any pediatric brain injuries. And so to go more in depth on the methods, so I wanted to provide a brief overview about what study participation looked like for our participants. So for recruitment, we used a variety of platforms to advertise and promote our study, including a platform called Mass General Partners Rally, which is affiliated with the MGB system and is a research sharing site. We also use Instagram and Facebook ads to kind of widen our range of recruitment. And women who signed up for our study, we called them over the phone and conducted some screening measures where we determined their eligibility. And so our main inclusion criteria was having at least one physically abusive incident from an intimate partner and also being at least 18 years old or older. And the main exclusion criteria was having any current symptoms and active symptoms of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or autism spectrum disorder that would potentially interfere with one's ability to participate effectively in the study. And those who were determined to be eligible, we called them for virtual interviews over Zoom. And these interviews gathered a wide variety of data, but particularly relevant for this study was brain injury history, both in women as children and in adulthood. And we also assessed levels of childhood trauma using the childhood trauma questionnaire. To go more in depth about the measures that we used for our study, so to look at IPV-related brain injury, we first used the OSU TBI identification method, which is a structured interview that elicits a lifetime history of brain injury from a variety of causes, but they also include a specific question about any violence-related brain injuries, whether you were shaken or whether you were punched or fell to the floor. So we also particularly looked at that question. We were assessing IPV-related brain injury. But we wanted to be very comprehensive in how we captured experiences of partner-related brain injury. So we also used Dr. Valera's brain injury severity assessment interview, or the BISA, to continue capturing more specifically experiences of partner violence-related brain injury. Specifically, this also gathers histories of strangulation-related brain injuries, as well as other causes that might be due to partner violence. We also use the same questionnaires when determining childhood brain injuries, but in this case, we were looking particularly at brain injuries that were sustained at or younger than 12 years old that were non-partner related brain injuries. Then we also categorize these as being child abuse or non-child abuse related. So in our study, we define child abuse related brain injury as having a brain injury that was perpetrated by someone such as an adult caregiver or a parent that was intentional. But for non-abuse related, those were often related to falls or sports related accidents. We also measured childhood trauma through the childhood trauma questionnaire. And this gathers information about physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and neglect among our participants, and a composite score using all of these different dimensions of a score of 35 or above indicated a significant history of childhood trauma. So for the specific analyses that we conducted, we first used a model of logistic regression with a binary predictor. So basically assessing whether there was an association between childhood brain injury at all and IPV-related brain injury in adulthood, adjusting for specific potential confounding variables like age, childhood trauma, and years of education. For our second model, we used a logistic regression, but using a continuous predictor where we would find the association between the number of childhood brain injuries and IPV-related PI, adjusting for the same covariates. And finally, we conducted a more exploratory logistic regression. We were really interested to see whether the type of brain injury in childhood, whether it be abuse or non-abuse related brain injury, would affect the types of associations that we saw with later IPV-related BI. So we also looked at those two associations. And so our results, our sample ended up being 129 women. On average, they had an age of 40 years old, completed 16 years of education on average, so correlating to completing a college level degree. And a large majority of our sample was community dwelling, but there were 2 women in our sample who were residing in a shelter at the time of our interview. And in terms of race, 60% or around 60% of the participants identified as white, followed by Hispanic, Black, and Asian. We also assessed childhood trauma levels and the prevalence of IPV and childhood brain injuries. So on average, participants had a CTQ score of 57.73. And again, a score of above 35 for the composite score is indicative of significant history of childhood trauma. So on average, these participants did have, unfortunately, significant histories of childhood trauma. 64%, around 64% experienced IPV-related BI, at least one. Around 30% experienced at least one childhood BI. And when we look particularly at the types of childhood BI, we see that nearly 11% experienced BIs from child abuse, while 19% experienced childhood BIs from other causes like falls or unintentional blunt trauma. And so for the association between childhood BI and IPV-related BI, we saw that participants who sustained at least one childhood BI from any mechanism, so whether that be abuse-related or non-abuse related, were significantly more likely to sustain a future IPV-related BI as an adult. So that was our first model. And then we also saw that the number of childhood BIs from any mechanism was significantly associated with IPV-related BI. And furthermore, when we looked at the associations between abuse-related versus non-abuse-related childhood BIs, we saw that participants who sustained at least one childhood BI from causes that were not abuse-related were significantly more likely to sustain a future IPV-related BI. But interestingly, we didn't find that same significant association for those who sustained abuse-related childhood BIs, which was a little bit surprising given the connections that we had seen before in the previous literature about childhood abuse and future intimate partner violence. But as you can see, the odds ratio is actually pretty high in comparison to what we found for participants who sustained non-abuse related childhood BIs, but it did not reach significance. So we were, kind of discussing this result in our lab and seeing whether, in the future we could look at this result among a larger sample and see if that would affect the kind of association that we see and whether it would actually reach significance. And so the implications of our study are pretty significant. So again, we saw that if you experienced at least one brain injury at or before the age of 12, that was significantly associated with sustaining at least one IPV-related brain injury later on in life. And so things that we really wanted to emphasize in our paper was how we can sort of address the association that we're seeing in our study. And so the first kind of set of recommendations that we put forth is the importance of prevention of pediatric brain injuries. And some examples of interventions that we were thinking of include implementing more robust parental and caregiver trainings, especially as it relates to implementing proper safety practices for children, particularly child safety seats in motor vehicles, as well as window and stair safety gates at home or wearing helmets while riding bicycles. So things like that can definitely help prevent pediatric brain injuries from occurring more frequently. We also thought about whether promoting wellness among parents and caregivers, as well as implementing measures to manage parental stress, could also help prevent both non-abuse related pediatric brain injuries and accidental ones, but as well as pediatric abuse related brain injuries as well. And it's important to note that, emphasizing proper safety practices can also be implemented within school settings so that children themselves can be educated at an early age on how to prevent themselves from sustaining brain injuries. And the second set of recommendations that we had was just improving overall awareness about brain injuries that are due to IPV. And this could take form in many different ways, whether it be through informative sessions in the school or clinical settings about partner or dating violence and how this could increase the risk of one sustaining an IPV-related brain injury. And we also thought about how these interventions could be especially important for those teenagers or adolescents who may have already sustained childhood brain injuries, no matter what the mechanism is, to kind of increase awareness about how there is a potential association between pediatric brain injuries and those sustained later on in life from IPV. And so some future research directions include, of course, gathering more racially diverse and larger samples. This is something that our lab is continually working on to recruit more people of color within our samples to really understand more comprehensively how our results that we obtain in the lab can really apply to a broader population of women experiencing IPV. And we thought this was especially important when we were thinking back to our results on abuse-related childhood BI and the connections with IPV-related BI. So potentially looking at a larger sample could help us clarify that association that wasn't necessarily statistically significant, but also had a very large odds ratio. So that's very important. Another future direction is exploring potential mediators of the relationship between childhood BI and IPV-related BI. So right now we're seeing an association between those two experiences, but we really want to know what makes this relationship occur, like what is underlying the different specific mechanisms through which this association is happening. So whether that be through psychological or social kinds of variables or anything else. And lastly, we always think it's important to really conduct qualitative research on the experiences of women who have undergone both childhood BI and IPV-related BI, just to understand more about how we can help treat and care for those who have undergone these experiences, as well as prevent these brain injuries from occurring in the first place. And so I wanted to end by just acknowledging my amazing co-authors, Eileen Tenreverdi, Annie Laurie Joseph, Dr. Grant Iverson, and Dr. Eva Lara, who were so instrumental in helping get this paper published and just really working on this important study. And we are also just so thankful to the women who participated and shared their experiences with us. This was really a wonderful study to conduct and to work on. So I'm really appreciative for the opportunity. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you again for having me, and I'm open to any questions that you may have.
Woohoo. All right, so you're spot on time. Does anyone, let me see, I'm going to see if anyone has any questions. If you could raise your hand so I can see you. Nobody has any questions? Angela, you just did. Oh, wait, Paul's got a question. Go ahead, Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Really interesting finding, and yeah, surprising that there wasn't a strong an association between abuse-related brain injury and subsequent IPV-related brain injury later in life. I'm wondering, and you mentioned modulators, so do you have any preliminary insight into whether adverse childhood events in that cohort, and because we know that that tends to lead to increased risk of IPV later in life? I'm just wondering if that's something that played into considerations. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. I was just very curious when we found these results, what kind of mediates the association. I know in prior literature, especially when looking specifically at child abuse and experiences of IPV, some studies talked about this kind of like effect that childhood abuse has on women, and really where women kind of get used to this sort of environment where there's a lot of household dysfunction, and that kind of mediates the risk of them kind of having these relationships in the future. So kind of thinking about the role of social support and how the lack of social support in childhood kind of mediates how one can sort of get involved in this kind of relationship in the future might be something interesting to study. But I think there's just so many different variables that could be impacted as well. But definitely looking at kind of the role of social support, I think would probably be something interesting to study.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. And Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire. That was
Hi,
a good.
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Joel. Okay, so I don't know if you said this or not, so forgive me if I missed this, but is there a correlation or were there any like stranger or acquaintance brain injury from violence
Mm,
for like correlation between like non-intimate partner, non-familiar, familial for younger into intimate partner violence. So like a brain injury from violence that is maybe a random person from
mm.
childhood.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I don't believe we actually, just because our sample size was so small, we actually didn't divide kind of the child abuse related brain injuries based on who perpetrated. We kind of just defined it more broadly as, oh, if it was a parent or an adult, or I think there were maybe a few instances where it wasn't actually an adult and it was kind of like a more random attack. But I think that was just very small, maybe like one or two people in our sample that actually underwent that experience. So we didn't actually have a chance to look at those specific associations. But I do believe that there could be some differences based on the perpetrator as well. So I think that's an important question to bring up and
Do
maybe
you
a
think
future
that
direction as well.
significant as to later in life brain injuries? I wonder if that would be significant
Mm,
or not. But
yeah.
I don't know. It was really good. But I'm just thinking of like to think about like into like, domestic violence versus like maybe acquaintance violence of children or, adolescents of those ages.
Right, right. Yeah, there's definitely, I would think that there's, as opposed to having like a stranger, have some sort of attack on you and then versus having someone in your household that you're quite close to have that sort of impact on you, I think that would mediate the relationship in some way to, IPV related brain injury, given that this is an intimate partner. But yeah, I would probably have to look at if there's any literature on that, but that's a good question.
Yeah.
Any other
Thank you.
questions?
All right. And looks like Julian Nemeth has done some work on peer violence, but with youth experiencing homelessness.
So Eve, this is
Okay.
Rachel. Hi, everybody.
So
This is Rachel
yeah,
Ramirez.
maybe you should check out Juliana's work. All right. So excellent. That was fabulous, Anjeli. And I don't know if I said your full name, Anjeli Macaranas. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I don't even know what to say. It's just wonderful. Thank you. You did a great job. And for anyone wondering, she was an absolute joy to work with and just seriously did an absolutely wonderful job. So thank you. Another big round of applause for Anjali. Woohoo! Cheers,
Thank you
cheers.
so much. Eve was
All right.
incredibly wonderful to work with. So, ditto.
Thank you. All right. So now we are going to go to another wonderful student. And this time, I'm going to read the right title. So this is Maria Zhu, and Maria's a sophomore at Harvard. So like I said before, unbelievably, she started working with me right out the gate as a freshman, which to me is just mind-blowing because there's so much you have to learn and do to begin with. But she did it and very successfully. So now she's a sophomore at Harvard College studying neuroscience and statistics. And she's still in my lab, obviously conducting this work. And so the focus of the work that she chose to look at is presented here is focusing on non-fatal strangulation. And also what she hasn't fully completed yet is looking at analyses related to non-fatal strangulation and structural brain morphology. So she's going to tell you as much of what she's done so far on that. And then ultimately, she hopes to promote health equity and improve care for women who have experienced intimate partner violence. And I am sure she will as soon as she's already doing it actually, so never mind. So without further ado, I would like to present Maria Zhu, and I think you have screen share capabilities, so you can just go ahead and do that.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the kind words, Eve. Can everyone hear me all right? I'll also share my screen and ask again if people can see my screen.
Good here?
Sorry?
Good.
Excellent. Thank you. Amazing. Can everyone see my screen?
Perfect.
Excellent. Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, and today I'll be talking about a project that I've been conducting for the past year in the Valera Lab. Specifically, I was looking at intimate partner violence-related non-fatal strangulation and characterizing the neurological impact of it in the women of the study, the same study that Anjeli was talking about earlier. Excellent. So first, I just want to give some brief context about non-fatal strangulation and intimate partner violence, why it's important to look at, and then what specifically we chose to look at. Firstly, intimate partner violence, as we know, is a serious and prevalent issue in the United States. Roughly 1 in 3 women in the United States will experience severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. One of the more common forms of physical violence that are experienced in intimate relationships is non-fatal strangulation. 68% of female survivors surveyed by Wilbur et al. In 2001 had been strangled by their intimate partner. In terms of the neurological outcomes of non-fatal strangulation is one common cause of acquired brain injuries. Acquired brain injuries are different from traumatic brain injuries, which occur from blunt force trauma to the head, for example, by an object or by a fist. An acquired brain injury can occur through strangulation. In strangulation, the physiological mechanism for this is a compression of the trachea and the carotids, which leads to a deprivation of oxygen and nutrients that go to the brain and therefore lead to brain damage. Oftentimes, what we will do to infer an acquired brain injury is we use alterations in consciousness. I'll talk a little bit more about alterations in consciousness when I get to the methods section and talking about which specific instruments we used. But an alteration in consciousness can include dizziness, it can include a loss in consciousness entirely, it can include memory loss of the event right before or right after, including other things that I'll talk about a little bit later. Non-fatal strangulation has been studied in some depth, and it's been found to be associated with PTSD, depression, suicidality, and worse performances on memory indicators. But specifically, non-fatal strangulation in certain characteristics of it hasn't been studied in as much depth in the literature. And so that's what we ended up focusing on. What does that actually mean, though? So the research objectives I had for the study was to analyze the relationship between characteristics of non-fatal strangulation, you'll see me use the acronym NFS, and neurobehavioral outcomes in women who have experienced IPV. But not only did we look at the presence of strangulation, we also looked at these certain characteristics. So that includes the presence of an alteration in consciousness during non-fatal strangulation. So that includes the dizziness, the memory loss, the loss of consciousness, the disorientation, the stunness that I talked about earlier. We looked at the presence of a loss of consciousness during non-fatal strangulation, and we looked lastly in an exploratory aim at the number of cumulative incidents of alterations in consciousness. And what we ended up doing is that we ended up doing comparisons within women who had been strangled of women who had sustained an alteration in consciousness during strangulation and women who had not sustained an alteration in consciousness during strangulation to see if there were differences in women who had sustained an alteration in consciousness. We looked at the difference between women who had sustained a full loss of consciousness during strangulation and women who had experienced an alternate form of an alteration in consciousness during strangulation that wasn't a loss in concentration, just so we could more specifically look at that difference. And then we just looked at the number of cumulative incidents of alterations in consciousness. Lastly, our aim here, and this is the one that's at the moment incomplete, was to analyze the brain morphometric characteristics of women experiencing IPV-related non-fatal strangulation using the structural MRI data that we collected on these participants. Amazing. So I won't belabor the study design since Anjeli's discussed it in great detail. There were 140 women in the sample. This is an ongoing study from 2021 to now, so just a few more than the amount of participants in Anjeli's study. They were age 18 plus and recruited primarily through the Rally website, which allows women to sign up for various MGB studies, social media, including Facebook and Instagram, and physical flyers that were posted around the MGH location. There are 2 general components to the study. The first is a remote component that is conducted over Zoom, and the second is an in-person component that is conducted at the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging. As for the remote component, there are a few things that I want to highlight. Cognitive testing, which we conduct through an instrument called the CNS vital signs. Balance testing, which we conduct through an instrument called SWAY. Various questionnaires that we use REDCap in order to capture information on, and then a semi-structured interview for which we collect several kinds of data for like neurobehavioral symptoms as well as abuse history. The in-person component includes MRI imaging, blood draws, hair collection, and then a quick eye test. In terms of important instruments that I want to highlight that we use and that I ended up using in my study, there's the OSU-TBI, so that's the Ohio State University Traumatic Brain Injury Identification Diagnostic. And we also included the BISA, so that's the Brain Injury Severity Assessment, and that's what we used in order to collect information on the alterations in consciousness that were sustained by participants during strangulation. We used the conflict tactics scale, that's a specific questionnaire, to ask whether or not participants had experienced any form of strangulation in the past. We used the audit, that's the alcohol use disorder identification method, I believe, in order to collect information about alcohol use. We used the PCL5, which asks about certain characteristics of the PTSD from the DSM-5, and it's a checklist that we assign scores to after to look at PTSD scores. And then perhaps more importantly, we use the neurobehavioral symptom inventory in order to collect data on various neurobehavioral symptoms. We'll talk a little bit more about. In terms of statistical analysis then, there were two main things that we did. The first was that we used Wilcoxon rank sum test and Fisher's exact test for a correlational analysis for our continuous and categorical variables respectively. We used Wilcoxon's R and Kramer's V for effect size measures and the Spearman's rank correlation to analyze the number of alterations in consciousness and the neurobehavioral symptom inventory outcomes. To note here is that we're just looking at associations between each of the neurobehavioral symptoms and then each of the characteristics of strangulation that I mentioned earlier. So that includes the presence and absence of strangulation, the presence of strangulation-related alteration in consciousness versus not having an alteration in consciousness during strangulation, etc., just isolating for those correlations and associations. Then after that, for the statistically significant relationships, we constructed multivariable linear and ordinal logistic regression models. Linear regression models are used for continuous variables. Ordinal logistic regression models are constructed because the way that the neurobehavioral symptom inventory works is that participants will record a score that basically assigns to the severity, with 0 essentially being that there was no severity associated with the specific neurobehavioral symptoms. So for example, dizziness in the last 2 weeks, and then increasing incrementally up by 1 for each of these scores. And that's the reason we use an ordinal logistic regression model. After that, we selected covariates that were significantly associated with each of the outcomes for each of the models to be distinct. The covariates that we looked at in order to see which ones were significant with the outcomes and which ones we should use in the models included age, education level, history of partner-related traumatic brain injury, alcohol intake, and neurological disorder, and that included migraines, encephalitis, epilepsy, brain tumor, etc. The reason that we chose these covariates is that they've all been studied in the literature as being associated strongly with the specific outcomes they were looking at. So for example, dizziness or loss in concentration has been linked to alcohol use or extended alcohol use for time. Cool. In terms of the results, a quick summary of the demographics information that we collected. We ended up subsplitting into 3 data subsets for our analyses, 140 that included all participants, 90 that included participants who had experienced strangulation, and 42 for participants who had experienced a strangulation-related alteration in consciousness. The mean age was 40 years. Majority of the population was white, 70%. There were 2 shelter residents. The rest of the participants in the study either lived at home or in a similar kind of situation, i.e. an apartment with family, etc. 65% indicated a history of strangulation, 31% a history of strangulation-related alteration in consciousness, and 16% a history of strangulation-related loss of consciousness. The first thing I want to look at then is just the presence of strangulation, which has been studied in the past. As you can see here, the statistically significant associations when we're just looking at the neurobehavioral outcomes and the presence and absence of strangulation include PTSD. PTSD is measured by the PCL5, with a PTSD checklist using the DSM-5, as well as loss of vision, which is quite significant, as you can see. The rest were not found to be statistically significant, just using a correlational analysis between them. So for these two variables, we then constructed multivariable ordinal logistic regression models and linear regression models. So firstly, looking at vision loss, what we can see here is that even after controlling for the covariates of age, history of traumatic brain injury, neurological disorder, and PTSD, there was still a significant relationship between the presence or absence of strangulation and vision loss. Or in more simple terms, what we can see from here is that participants who had experienced strangulation on the whole reported a statistically significantly more severe grading of vision loss on the neurobehavioral symptom inventory than participants who had not been strangled. And so that's what we can see using vision loss, which is significant even after we do this confounding variable, multivariable analysis. We should also note, and I'll note this in the future, that neurological disorder will continue to be very significant when we look at it as a covariate for essentially about every single regression analysis that we do with it as a covariate. Differently, however, when we look at a linear regression model where we're looking at the association between strangulation and PTSD, we find that it is no longer statistically significant after we control for the covariates of history of traumatic brain injury and neurological disorder, such that we are unable to conclude that a presence of strangulation for individuals is associated with essentially a higher average score on the PCL5, which measures PTSD. But the next thing that we wanted to look at was an alteration in consciousness during strangulation, because we thought that it might be interesting and it actually might be informative to look at the specific characteristics that happen during strangulation and if that is actually specifically associated with certain outcomes. And so what we did here is that we compared individuals or participants who had experienced an alteration in consciousness during strangulation versus participants who had not experienced an alteration in consciousness who were strangled. And then we looked at these associations. As you can see, there are a lot of statistically significant associations just when looking at the neurobehavioral outcomes and the presence of and absence of alteration in consciousness during strangulation. That includes PTSD, dizziness, vision loss, and loss of concentration. For the sake of time, I didn't include the regression models for the ones that were not at all significant, but I've included some of the ones that are interesting to look at. So for example, here is the multivariable ordinal logistic regression with vision loss. As you can see here, after controlling for history of traumatic brain injury and neurological disorder, strangulation-related alteration in consciousness is no longer significantly associated with vision loss or change in the severity of vision loss. However, it is quite close to the statistically significant threshold of 0.05 that we set for the p-value. And so it is interesting to look at when it comes to whether or not there might be an important difference. And I'll discuss the lack of statistical power in our study a little bit more when I get to the discussion section. We should keep this in mind as maybe an interesting association that we've found. With regard to PTSD, again, we can find that there is no statistically significant association after controlling for the covariates of history of traumatic brain injury and neurological disorder. The next characteristic that we looked at was the presence of a loss of consciousness during strangulation, as opposed to another form of alteration in consciousness. So for example, participants who fully lost consciousness during non-fatal strangulation versus participants who reported dizziness or who reported feeling that they were disoriented or who reported feeling that they had a loss of memory or reported that they saw stars or spots instead of losing consciousness entirely. For this, what we can see is the only statistically significant association when it comes to just this correlational analysis is PTSD. The other ones are not significant, but we included loss of hearing as a regression model just because it's so close to the threshold and because the sample size in this case is so small, it's only 42. If we look at it then, we can see that PTSD is actually significantly associated with strangulation-related loss of consciousness. That is to say that participants who experienced a loss of consciousness during strangulation had a significantly higher score on the PCL-5 than participants who had experienced another form of alteration in consciousness during strangulation. This is even after controlling for the covariates of TBI history and neurological disorder. With hearing loss, we can also see that strangulation LOC is significantly associated with hearing loss, with a greater severity of hearing loss, even after controlling for alcohol intake. In this case, alcohol intake was the only covariate that was significantly associated with hearing loss, and so was the only one that we used in this instance as a covariate in the regression model. The last exploratory aim that we wanted to look at was just the number of cumulative strangulation-related alterations in consciousness that participants experienced during their lifetime. In this case, you can see that there are a number of significant associations using the Spearman's correlation: PTSD, dizziness, vision loss, and loss of concentration. Again, for the sake of time, I'll only include the regression models that showed some form of significance or that were interesting, perhaps, to note. In this case, you can see that PTSD is really not statistically significant after controlling for these covariates. Again, you can note that neurological disorder is significant, as it has been with most of these neurological outcomes. And here's just a representation for dizziness and vision loss. It's a little bit easier to see. What you can see is that the number of alterations in consciousness is not statistically significantly associated with dizziness. That is to say, there is not a significant positive correlation between the number of alterations in consciousness and a higher severity of dizziness, although it's close to the threshold. However, there is a significant association between the number of alterations in consciousness sustained by individuals and a severity of vision loss that we recorded using the neurobehavioral symptom inventory, even after controlling for these various covariates. With that being said, I want to give a quick summary of these results, since I know there were a lot of tables to look at. The first important thing to note is that women who were strangled reported significantly higher levels of vision loss than women who were not strangled, even after controlling for compounds. Secondly, that women who were strangled with a loss of consciousness reported significantly higher levels of PTSD and hearing loss than women who sustained another form of alteration in consciousness that was not a loss of consciousness during strangulation, even after controlling for compounds. And then lastly, that the number of alterations in consciousness sustained had a positive correlation with vision loss, even after controlling for compounds. So these are specific neurobehavioral outcomes that we found to be significant: vision loss, PTSD, and hearing loss across the different characteristics that we looked at in terms of strangulation. I want to lastly talk about some of the implications of the study, both specifically towards strangulation in this instance, but also broadly towards how we should be looking at IPV-related strangulation in the future and what might be interesting to study. The first is that we found novel findings of long-term vision loss and hearing loss as an associated outcome of a non-fatal strangulation. The reason this is interesting to look at is because prior literature has only really found short-term vision loss and hearing loss as immediate effects of non-fatal strangulation using the same physiological mechanism that I talked about earlier, the compression of the carotids and the trachea causing oxygen and nutrient deprivation, which is especially harmful to the brain, which is a high metabolic organ. But more importantly, and I think maybe more importantly towards the field of IPV strangulation research, is that we found that the immediate effects of strangulation, so for example, whether or not the participant experienced an alteration in consciousness or loss of consciousness, is actually really important to study and consider in the context of long-term effects. In another way of saying this, it means that it's maybe a little bit insufficient to just look at whether or not participants experience strangulation. It's also important to look at the characteristics of strangulation, so whether or not they experience an alteration in consciousness or loss of consciousness, and perhaps also the number of times that they experience an alteration in consciousness, because as our study seems to suggest, that will cause a difference in the neurobehavioral outcomes that they will experience long term. This can be really important when it comes to informing both policy decisions that we look at for women who have experienced strangulation as a result of intimate partner violence, but also just in terms of immediate responses, in terms of the way that we should respond to strangulation, for example, in a clinical setting, and the kinds of questions that we should ask and the kinds of information that we should collect about the form of strangulation that they may have experienced during intimate partner violence. The third thing to mention is that our study reinforces the idea that it's important to consider a large and diverse range of confounding variables, since they are importantly associated with the neurobehavioral outcomes that we look at. Specifically in this instance, PTSD, traumatic brain injury history, audit scores, so that's alcohol use history, as well as neurological disorder, are important to consider as covariates when we're doing this form of analysis. The last thing that I want to mention, perhaps as a way, or perhaps as a limitation of our study, is that our relatively small sample size, so 140, and then for some of our analyses even smaller, 90 and 42, as well as the complex confounding effect from interrelated adjustment variables. And what that just means is that many of our covariates were in and of themselves related. So for example, PTSD is related itself to traumatic brain injury history. Alcohol history might also be related to PTSD in some ways, just meant that we all had less statistical power when it came to our results. This is important when it comes to if you saw some of our p-values that were close to the cusp of significance. And what that means here is that larger samples should be recruited in the future to validate some of our results, given our lower statistical power in this specific study. The last thing I want to talk about are some next steps. As I mentioned earlier, we're currently looking at evaluating structural brain morphology in these women. And the reason that we're doing that is because we want to isolate a physiological mechanism for the neurological outcomes that we are now seeing in these women. So for example, if we are seeing severe vision loss in women who have experienced strangulation, is that because of perhaps certain kinds of changes that have happened to the optic chiasm? Is that perhaps due to some other kinds of changes that we can trace to certain subcortical volumes or surface areas that we can actually measure using the structural MRI data that we've collected? What I've done here is I've just made a quick visualization with a participant using FreeSurfer. So as you can see here, these are just axial, coronal, and sagittal views. What I've done is I've bordered the gray matter and the white matter inside, and I've also color-coded the specific regions to different colors. What we'll be looking at is whether or not we can look at these subcortical volumes and whether or not there are relationships with the neurobehavioral outcomes that we have found in order to find those physiological mechanisms. And that'll be our next step in the study. Thank you, and I want to acknowledge all of these people as well as everybody else in our lab that's been so instrumental in collecting data, in being helpful during lab meetings, as well as just everything else in terms of questions that I've ever had. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. I am, same as Anjeli, humbled and honored to be here today presenting in front of you, and very happy and honored to be in Dr. Valera's lab, where I've learned so much over the past year. So thank you so much for listening.
Yay! Good job, Maria! Woohoo! Thank you, Maria. And does anyone have any questions for Maria? Yes, Julia. Hi, Julia. Good to see you. We can't hear you, though.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Hi, Eve. I'm so happy to see you. Maria, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very clear, as well as Anjeli's. It was really interesting to hear both of your talk. And I have a very specific question, and I hope I didn't just miss it, but you mentioned a measure for balance. And I was wondering if you included that in the analyses or if that was included as a neurobehavioral symptom, if you found anything with that. I'd be very interested to learn more about your findings in the future too in relation to brain structure.
Thank you. We didn't look at the sway balance data for this specific study because we focused more on the neurobehavioral symptoms, but I definitely agree that balance is very interesting to look at. I would also want to, I think, study more of the cognitive data that we collected from the CNSVS instrument as well when it comes to relation and strangulation and these characteristics.
Thank you.
And Julia, we actually are using sway to look at some other stuff. So it's partly we have so many variables, we can't put them all in one.
Yeah.
in one study, but that's an excellent question. But we're
Yeah,
trying
there's
to,
really such
it's,
little literature there.
and there's so, well, and here, especially with what we're doing already, we had like, there's a little bit of a complexity to how we're at carving up the data and stuff. But we actually are looking at balance, and hopefully we'll have something out soon. We're like trying to get it out to its last leg to getting out. So
Yeah,
hopefully, that will be coming out soon.
just anecdotally, I've interviewed so many women who have balance issues. But I don't know any literature on that. So
Me
I
too.
look forward to learning more about your findings. Thank
Yeah, and
you.
Paul may have his hand up because he may be saying something about that too. I'm not sure, but Paul's next. So go ahead, Paul.
Thanks. And yeah, we have some balanced data too that we're in the process of writing up. So it's definitely there's deficits there. My question though is around the main effects seem to be around vision and auditory processing or consistently. And I'm wondering, is that related to the fact that those end organs, so the retina and the cochlea, are also in the head and supposedly affected by the blood supply deficits that happen during strangulation? So not just the central processing of that information, but the actual sensory organs themselves might also be disrupted.
That is definitely interesting. I feel as if in my search of the literature that has not been as discussed. I think that it is important to consider. And definitely, I think when we are doing more of the structural part of the study and then looking at the physiological mechanisms is important to keep in mind when we look at vision and hearing loss, which I know as Dr. Valera and I discussed was quite, I think, a surprise to both of us since I like it hadn't really come up in any of my research as a long-term effect of strangulation or in fact of any kind of IPV-related brain injury in the past.
Yeah, it's really fast. Thanks.
And just one other note is, I mean, we're using a scale that like talks about like vision, and so I don't know exactly what it means. Like I don't know to what degree someone might say, oh yeah, I have vision problems, but I don't know exactly what that means. They can't see, things get blurred. We don't have a level of detail that might be something that would be worth following up with based on, I think, some of these data, if they're really, we're really seeing these relationships. And so that's another thing to think about that and for me at least, I feel like we have to learn a little bit more about vision itself and what we would want to know in terms of trying to follow this up or try to figure out more about what's going on.
Yeah, totally. I think,
Yeah.
more direct assessments of, basic visual function or auditory function. I think there are ways to kind of constrain it to more the peripheral processing rather than the central processing. So definitely worth following up for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul, for that question. Wish we knew the answer. We will find out. Does anyone else have any questions? Wow, we're doing so well on time. Any other questions? We have time for one more question if anyone has one. All right. So thanks to both of you. That was really awesome. And so I just want to, and Nick, our tried and true faithful, thanks for joining us at 5 in the morning. And I know this was worth your time. So I'm not even gonna say I hope it was. I know it was. So I know you got up for a good reason. And I just want to remind people that we are not having a meeting for the next 2 months for Pink, but we do, so we'd see you in January, but we do want, in November, there's going to be the joint Enigma Pink 2-day conference. And so we do ask for you to join that. That's actually coming up a couple of weeks. I actually will be in South Africa, so I will not be able to make that meeting. But I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And if I had a link, I would put it in there. But if you look up Enigma, you can find it. Sorry, yeah, I wasn't as prepared because Catherine asked me about that in the last second, so I didn't get a chance to. It's my fault. I'm not gonna link Catherine. I should have been well prepared. So anyway, but yes, please. That's one of the reasons we're not having a Pink meeting because we are going to be having the joint Enigma Pink conference. It's a 2-day conference, and it's last year it was a huge success. It was the first year they had it, and this year I know it's going to be awesome too. And it's got lots of great speakers and young speakers and not as young speakers, so it's a broad range. And so I hope all of you can join for that. And unless anyone has, if anyone has any other questions, now your last chance to ask. And otherwise, one last big round of applause for Anjeli and Maria. Thank you so much. You did great jobs. And otherwise, we will see you at the Enigma conference, the pink/Enigma conference, and or in January. Thanks so much for everybody for joining. Always enjoy seeing everyone's faces. Take care, everybody. I guess Catherine's gonna go.